Good day, today we look at linking the form to the data source. We have created a layout with a container, a data source, a dialog box and a form with some fields. Our dialog is named Contact Entry. Inside it, it has a card text component. We place our form inside the dialog and link it to the card text component of the dialog. We also specify the title of the dialog, and this time we hide the cancel button. We add a form inside the dialog and give it a name. We link the dialog card text component with the form by giving the form a parent ID. The form data will use the user's table. We give that a record source, later a primary key and auto increment. The fields specified here are on our Project Manager database. That is the database we created in the Mashy Teaches series. You will note that some of this content we specify, usually we did in the data source. We are doing it on the form because we want to link both the data source and data table from the form. In our Project Manager database, we have a users table with two fields. You will remember that we previously saved the hash passwords for the users. On the form we have added two fields, one for the email address and one for the password. We have bypassed adding rows and columns because the fields will build the grid. We select email from the component types. We then specify the field name from the database table. This is followed by the vmodel, the field title and hint. This is a required field, will receive autofocus too. As this is a text field, we leave out the properties we do not need. We are using this special VField because it's the only one that has the capability to build grids automatically. We select an appropriate data type for the field, then specify the grid position. This will be in row 1, column 1. We just took a sneak peek on the user's table design. Like I said, this component should be placed in row 1 column 1 of the grid, inside the VForm. On DT table means the field should appear on the data table. We will talk about that later. The second field we have added inside the form is for the password. We follow the same approach, but this time we select password as a component type. We give it the table field name, title, hints, etc. We want this component to be placed in row 2 column 1. We will also tell it that we also select the data type and that this field will be used for CRUD functionality. Compared to before, our data source is almost empty. It will be built by the contents we specified on the form and the collection of fields inside the form. Also note that the dynamic property is unchecked. This is because we will use the PHP configuration file to specify our database connection settings. So this time around, we use minimal settings, as we have already entered this content on the form. We want to execute a select query to the database to check the entered email address and password. Let's generate the needed callbacks. These will trap our output from the database. We will trap the select where callback. This event will be fired after the query is executed. We now have a form and a data source on our code. After we load the layout, we will call the CreateForm method. This builds the grid for the form and the respective components we chose. As we want to link the form to the data source, we need to call link data source after we have created the form. This automatically links the form schema to the data source, using the fields we created inside the form. When the OK button is clicked, we will get the form contents, create a hash of the password, and then execute a select where clause. This searches for a match on the users table. When successful, a toast notification will be displayed. If an error happens, the error message will be written to the console log. Usually we hide dialogues when opening pages. For this dialog, we want it to be shown, so we will uncheck hidden. Let us run the application so that we can enter some contents. This will help us to see if our app works as expected. The login dialog is shown. We will enter an email address and password. We have used a wrong password on purpose, so that the error toast is shown. On success, the login dialog is hidden. Perhaps let's log everything that happens inside the data source, so that we can see. You will recall that we only linked it with the form details and fields. We check the show log property to do that. Let's also see the details of our PHP config file. The config file is being used because our data source dynamic property is turned off. We will now look at the data source logs during execution of the application. We enter our login details. Here we see all the statements that executed on the data source. All of this is based on what was entered on the form, then on the fields, and then linked to the data source. We don't see this in our code as it's abstracted for safety.